When people talk about retro video games, they quite often talk about the Nintendo Entertainment System, Master System, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive. But I think I want to talk about something else. The old Amiga, the Commodore 64, one of my favourite home computing systems from the 1990s, mostly because it plays a heck of a lot of video games, not because of its programming and office abilities. One of the games I wanted to have a look at today was Kid Gloves 2. It's a game I knew nothing about at the time. It was one of those games you happen to come across because someone had copied it off someone else, as you did before the internet. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I haven't looked at it in a while, so I figure it's time we looked back at Kid Gloves 2. Now, when I first played Kid Gloves 2, I had no idea whether or not it was actually a sequel or whether it's purely a number 2 for the sake of numbering. I was young, forgive me. In my research, I found out that Kid Gloves was actually a game published by Millennium in 1990 for the same system and ported across to a few others as well. It wasn't quite the same game as what I was used to with Kid Gloves 2. It's a single screen platformer where you shoot bullets to defeat enemies and collect keys to pass through doors. Having not played this at the time, I can't say whether I would have enjoyed it when I was younger or not. Looking at some of the reviews though, it only got mediocre, between 60 and 70%, so suffice to say it was, you know, a reasonable game, but at £25 it probably wasn't the best spend of money. There was probably better games out there at the time. 2 years after the release of Kid Gloves, in 1992, Kid Gloves 2 would hit the market, once again at £25, and it seemed to be less favourable than the original. Having a look at the games myself, I can't see why. I'm definitely going to go over why Kid Gloves 2 is not a fantastic game, but it's got some charm, and I think it's definitely better than the original. As you can probably tell, Kid Gloves 2 is a completely different animal to its predecessor. That's mostly because it wasn't actually intended to be the sequel. It was a completely separate game developed under the name of Little Bo. Instead of running around, jumping, using magical punching gloves to attack enemies, this Kid Gloves uses swords, axes and daggers to defeat enemies in this game. Core concepts still stand. You still have to find keys to pass through doors to complete levels and defeat enemies that get in your way. And all of this is in aid of saving your girlfriend, which has been kidnapped by an evil wizard. Couldn't get more cliched if you tried, but it's 1992, it's a small development team, let's not give them too much flack. Levels are scattered with a handful of enemies, most of which containing bonus items that are purely there for points. Some contain health boosts, there are some even with poison to take away some of the kids' health. The usual standard fare in video games. The idea is to go through each level in a pseudo maze, trying to find the one enemy that has the key to help the kid escape. Whilst not overtly challenging, a lot of these enemies can get rather tiresome with the constant head-on attacks that don't relent at all, especially when you've got the small dagger and no range whatsoever with the weapon. This is counterbalanced by two things. One, you can charge your swing of your sword, which will increase the damage done to the enemy, taking fewer hits. Or if you're lucky enough to find critters or fireballs, you can attack from a distance, which is quite handy. These are few and far between, and even when you collect the balloon which helps you fly across gaps, you can still fire these, which you couldn't possibly do with a sword, which you'd end up bursting the balloon. The levels themselves are rather sparse. There's a few mini games hidden here and there by collecting tokens, entering into arcade machines and the slot machines for bonuses and extra rewards. Enemy placement, as I've said before, is rather sparse, and in some of the levels the background and the foreground are impossible to tell apart, and more than once I found myself stuck on what are supposedly ladders. I can't work out what's wrong with it. It could be my joystick, it could be the programming. Who can possibly tell? To find your kidnapped girlfriend, the kid has to travel across 5 islands ice, water, fire, sand, wind, before finally reaching the centre, the castle, where the evil wizard is holding her captive. There isn't much between these levels, each divided into 4 sections, but there is a small animation of the island being restored back to its former glory, and a little hint from your girlfriend as to the in-game mechanics of the next level. These game mechanics, although may appear later on in further levels, generally don't see much time. A lot of the time is spent running from one end of the screen to the other, trying to find that key to get through the door. On each island, come the 4th and final section though, you will be met with a boss. These are, you know, interesting little diversions. Most of their attack patterns are quite simple. There's nothing really necessarily challenging here, especially if you've got yourself stocked up with fireballs, but there's some interesting characters here. My only gripe is that they all seem to be copy-pasted. There only seems to be 3 methods of attack pattern and across 6 bosses. It's really quite disappointing to get all the way to the final boss and decide that the second boss in was probably the hardest. So after all your hard work of braving the elements and facing your fears, fighting down monsters, what is your reward at the end of this adventure? Well, obviously they're not going to show what you're actually going to get, but I think it's implied. So, what is my opinion now of Kid Gloves 2? I can see why I enjoyed it as a kid. It's bright, it's colourful, it's very easy to pick up and play. But I can definitely see why the reviewers gave it such a low score. Having trouble platforming, suicidal enemies that will rush straight headlong at you, it's not a good fun experience. It gets quite frustrating the longer you play it. All in all, I can say to you that if you are an Amiga enthusiast, it's well worth picking up. It's a fun little platformer, definitely worth a go. But if you have no interest in these retro games, it's not worth your time, it's not worth your effort. I wouldn't recommend seeking it out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a young lady to show a small dagger to. Wait, sword, big sword, big sword, yes.